In the last video, we explored how this cognitive function appears in the conscious mind through the hero, parent, child, and inferior functions. But the story doesn't end there. The same cognitive function also exists in the shadow. It doesn't become a different function. It simply becomes less conscious, less trusted, and often reveals itself in very different ways. Let's take a look. Part 1. The function in the shadow. In Part 1, we looked at introverted sensing in its more conscious positions: the hero, parent, child, and inferior functions. In those positions, the relationship with introverted sensing can range from deeply trusted and relied upon to somewhat uncertain or underdeveloped. But even when introverted sensing moves into the shadow, the function itself does not change. What changes is the person's awareness of it, their trust in it, and the circumstances under which they tend to rely on it. In the shadow, introverted sensing is generally less conscious and less comfortable to access. Instead of naturally comparing the present to an internal library of past experiences, familiar patterns, bodily impressions, and established reference points, a person may become much more reactive about those things. They might suddenly become preoccupied with what has happened before, whether something feels familiar or unfamiliar, whether a previous mistake is about to happen again, or whether the current situation is deviating from what they consider reliable. This doesn't automatically make introverted sensing unhealthy. The same ability to remember details, recognize patterns from experience, preserve what has worked, and notice changes in one's internal state is still there. The difference is that the person has a less stable relationship with it. They may distrust what their own experience is telling them, or swing in the opposite direction and become unusually attached to it when they feel threatened. That becomes especially interesting as we move through the shadow positions, because introverted sensing takes on a different psychological role in each one. First, it can become something we worry about, then something we criticize, then something that creates confusion, and finally, something that only appears when psychological pressure becomes extreme. Part 2. Nemesis Function. The nemesis position is associated with ESFP and ESTP. Here, introverted sensing becomes a source of worry and insecurity. The nemesis is often where a function becomes something a person feels they need to defend themselves against. With introverted sensing, that can mean becoming unusually concerned about the past, precedent, reliability, or the possibility that something previously experienced is about to repeat itself. Instead of simply remembering an experience and using it as useful information, the person may start asking, "What if this happens again?" For example, imagine someone trying something new at work after having a bad experience with a similar project in the past. Under normal circumstances, that previous experience could simply provide useful information. But when introverted sensing enters the nemesis position, the memory can become much more emotionally charged. The person may start looking for similarities between the current situation and the old one, becoming increasingly suspicious that the same problems are going to return. This can also create defensiveness around established routines and expectations. A person may become unusually alert when something changes unexpectedly, especially if they don't trust that the new approach will work. They might insist that something be done the way it was done before, not necessarily because the old method is objectively better, but because the familiar method gives them something concrete to rely on. There's also a more personal side to this. Introverted sensing can bring attention to internal physical and emotional experiences, so the nemesis relationship may involve worrying about whether something feels wrong internally. A small sensation, an unfamiliar reaction, or a subtle change in one's usual state can become something worth monitoring closely. The function that normally provides useful internal reference points can instead become a source of uncertainty. Is this normal? Has this happened before? Should I be concerned? So the nemesis relationship with introverted sensing isn't simply an obsession with the past. It's more about insecurity surrounding what the past, familiarity, and personal experience are telling you. The person may become highly alert to these things precisely because they don't feel completely confident in their ability to interpret them. And that brings us to a different relationship with introverted sensing. Not worrying about what it might tell you, but becoming frustrated with what it tells you in the first place. Part 3. Critic Function. The critic position is associated with ISFP and ISTP. Here, introverted sensing becomes highly critical. The critic function often takes something that could be useful and turns it into a standard that is difficult to satisfy. With introverted sensing, this can involve harsh judgments about whether something is accurate, familiar enough, consistent enough, or faithful enough to previous experience. Instead of simply recognizing what has worked before, the person may become frustrated when reality doesn't match the internal reference point they have created. This can produce a particularly strong form of perfectionism. Imagine someone recreating a meal they have made dozens of times. They know roughly how it should taste, smell, and feel. If the result is slightly different, they may not simply think, "That's a little different today." They might become fixated on what went wrong and mentally compare the result against the previous version. The same thing can happen with memories and personal standards. Someone may look back at an earlier decision and become extremely critical of themselves for not remembering a detail, not noticing a warning sign, or not doing something the way they believe they should have. Their experience becomes evidence in an internal trial, and they are constantly evaluating whether they lived up to their own precedent. That criticism can also be directed outward. Other people may seem careless when they ignore lessons that appear obvious from previous experience. Someone might think, "We've already tried this. Why are we doing it again?" Or, "Didn't we learn what happened last time?" The frustration comes from seeing experience as something that should provide a reliable record, while other people appear to be disregarding that record. But the critic isn't necessarily wrong about the value of experience. In fact, its criticism often points towards something genuinely useful. Experience does contain information. The problem is that the information can become a standard rather than a resource. Instead of asking what the past can teach us, the critic may ask whether the present has lived up to the past. And when that internal reference system becomes even less reliable, introverted sensing can move into the trickster position. Part 4. Trickster Function. The trickster position is associated with ENFJ and ENTJ. Here, introverted sensing becomes something of a blind spot. The difficulty with the trickster isn't necessarily that the person cannot use introverted sensing. It's that they can have trouble recognizing when it is relevant, accurate, or even happening at all. Their relationship with personal experience and internal reference points can become inconsistent, creating situations where they believe they understand what is happening, only to discover that an important piece of information was missing. One common example is assuming that something will work because it makes sense in the current situation without sufficiently accounting for what happened before. A person might confidently change a process because the new approach seems more efficient, only to discover that the old process existed for a reason. Something about the practical history of the situation was overlooked. The opposite can happen too. A person may suddenly become very focused on a specific memory or past detail, but have difficulty determining whether that detail is actually relevant. The result can be mixed signals. One moment, past experience seems completely unimportant, and the next, one isolated experience suddenly feels like decisive evidence. This can make introverted sensing especially tricky in disagreements. One person may be thinking about the concrete history of what actually happened, while the other is focused on what should happen based on the current situation. Both can feel like they're being perfectly reasonable. But if the person with introverted sensing in the trickster position tries to argue from memory, they may accidentally misremember details, overlook context, or become overly certain about an experience that isn't as reliable as they think. The unintended consequences can be surprisingly practical. Forgotten routines, overlooked details, repeating an old mistake, or failing to recognize that something has changed can all emerge from this blind spot. And because the blind spot is difficult to see from the inside, the person may not realize that introverted sensing is contributing to the problem until the consequences become obvious. But the trickster is still different from the demon. The trickster creates confusion around the function. The demon brings the function forward under much greater psychological pressure. Part 5. Demon Function. The demon position is associated with INFJ and INTJ. Here, introverted sensing can emerge during moments of extreme psychological pressure. Most of the time, this relationship may barely be noticeable. The person can go through everyday life without consciously relying on introverted sensing very much. But when their usual psychological strategies stop working, the function can suddenly appear with surprising intensity. With introverted sensing, this may look like becoming consumed by the past, trapped in memories, or intensely focused on personal experiences that have accumulated over time. Instead of using previous experience as one source of information, the person may suddenly treat it as overwhelming evidence. Old mistakes, failures, disappointments, or painful experiences can become extremely vivid, creating the feeling that the past is defining what is possible in the present. This can become destructive when the person starts interpreting the present entirely through negative precedent. This happened before, so it will happen again. I've seen how this ends. I should have known better. The mind can create an increasingly narrow loop in which every new experience is compared against the worst things that have already happened. There can also be a physical dimension to this. Under extreme stress, someone may become unusually aware of bodily sensations, exhaustion, discomfort, or changes in their normal state. Rather than calmly noticing those signals, they may fixate on them. The internal reference system that could normally provide useful information becomes amplified into something that feels impossible to ignore. But this is where the demon position becomes more nuanced. Introverted sensing itself isn't the enemy. Even when it emerges in a destructive way, it is still trying to provide information about experience, continuity, and what has been learned before. The problem is the extreme psychological state in which that information is being accessed. With greater self-awareness, the person can begin separating memory from prediction. A past experience can be acknowledged without assuming it determines the future. A mistake can become information instead of a permanent verdict. Familiarity can provide a reference point without becoming a prison. And in that sense, the demon can occasionally reveal something valuable. A function that once appeared only as an overwhelming flood of memories or negative precedent can eventually become a source of resilience. The person may learn to draw on everything they have experienced without becoming controlled by it, to recognize patterns, remember what they have learned, notice when something genuinely feels different, and use the past as information rather than as a prophecy. By now, hopefully you've seen that this cognitive function never actually changed. Even in the Nemesis, Critic, Trickster, and Demon functions, it remained the same underlying cognitive process. What changed was the person's relationship with it. Rather than being trusted and consciously relied upon, it became less conscious, less trusted, and often revealed itself during moments of stress, insecurity, or psychological pressure. Understanding the shadow isn't about labeling parts of yourself as good or bad. It's about recognizing that every cognitive function has both conscious and unconscious expressions, and that becoming aware of them is an important step toward understanding both yourself and others.